let us continue with the second part of my lecture, which is big data architecture. Just to catch up, we have spent the first section describing what big data is. That led us to understand what a traditional solution looks like. We have seen those circumstances or conditions under which the traditional solution gets trained, and now we are trying to understand what the big data architecture or big data hardware software solution looks like. So unlike a traditional solution where we used a single machine, here in big data we use a collection of machines that are connected to each other. We call them a cluster, right? So it's a collection of machines, but just connecting machines with each other is not enough. What you also need is a software which takes all these machines and makes them work as a single unit. So the hardware part comprises of machines connected with each other, and the software is something special that makes this entire collection of machines appear as a single unit. But not all clusters are big data clusters. In fact, astronomers are actually used to a kind of cluster known as the HPC. For example, I used to work in IUCAA, and IUCAA, all clusters were HPC clusters. So what is the HPC cluster? So it's called high performance computing cluster, and it too is a collection of machines. Yes, they are connected with each other, but each individual machine doesn't have any storage beyond some basic operating system storage. And for storage, they rely on a network attached storage, which is generally a RAID storage. And what happens is that it is mounted on each of these machines. So if I am logged into machine 1, I can see the data on this RAID storage system. Even if I am logged into machine 4, I can see it. So it's like all the machines through the network are basically accessing the same storage. Whenever data needs to be read, any machine, since it has a network connectivity with the storage system, can pick up the data and bring it here. And whenever they are finished processing and they need to write some data, they will write it on this machine. So this is what the high performance computing cluster looks like. All right. And this kind of a cluster is designed for high computation. For example, n-body simulations. So imagine that there's a galaxy. The galaxy is made up of like 10 power 5 stars. It is not analytically possible for us to understand what each star will do because of the gravitational influence of all the other stars. In which case, what you do is you run an n-body simulation to understand how galaxies evolve. Similarly, you want to understand the radiative processes happening within, say, an active galactic nucleus or on the surface of the sun or whatever. These are also not easy to solve analytically, therefore you have to solve them numerically. So all of these use cases require very high computing power, and this is what the HPC is designed to do. But it is not good for big data. And why is that? Because we have already said that one of the things about big data is that the volume is very high. And if we are going to rely on the entire data to be stored in a network attached storage, and whenever we process the data, we have to keep transferring that data from that storage to this machine, you have tremendous amount of data flowing through the network, and that chokes up the network and everything slows down. So the HPC is not designed for big data analysis. And the primary reason is because HPCs assume that data input output over the network is minimal, whereas big data by definition means that data input output over network is going to be very large. And since that is a very slow part of the network, this is not a good idea. So what does the big data cluster look like? Well, it is also a cluster of machines, but the difference is, unlike the typical machine of a HPC, which had very limited local storage, Each machine in the big data cluster has high amount of local storage. That is a major differentiating factor in the big data cluster. There is no network attached storage. Each machine has its own storage capacity. The second important thing about big data clusters is that each machine is what you would call a commodity hardware. So what exactly is a commodity hardware? Well, follow this simple rule. If you can go on a website and order a piece of hardware, it can be considered commodity. However, if you have to sit down with the manufacturer, give them specifications, and then they are going to manufacture it for you, then it is not a commodity hardware. So it is very important that big data clusters be commodity hardware. And the reason for that is simple. Because suddenly you get a volume of data and you realize, oh, the volume has increased, my existing cluster is not enough, I need more machines. You cannot wait for the manufacturer to design and deliver a machine to you. You need to be able to pick up machines and attach them to your cluster on the spot, which is why big data clusters are designed to have variable number of machines, and therefore each machine must be a commodity hardware. And an extremely important principle is the data locality principle. This is extremely important for big data cluster. So the way you think of data locality is that you want to implement an algorithm for some data processing. And let us suppose the first server on the top left has, this one has some data which it is guarding. Then the algorithm is designed in such a way that the data is processed by the machine where the data is already stored. So this data is processed by the machine on which it already sits. The data is not transferred to another machine, which is against like what HPC does. In HPC, you're always transferring data from the network attached storage to the nodes, whereas here, each node has its own storage and it says, I'm going to work on my data. And only minimum amount of data I will exchange over the network. So that is data locality, and it's the heart and soul of big data analysis. Okay, so we've looked at the hardware of big data. Let's now look at big data software. There are two important components that are needed for a big data software. One, a distributed file system whose job is to take all the disks of all the machines and make them appear as one single disk. So this is very similar to the RAID controller, but whereas the RAID controller was a specialized piece of hardware with many disks constituting it, here you have independent machines with their own hard disks, and we are going to take these individual machines' hard disks and present them as if one big hard disk is there. That's the job of a distributed file system. The second component of a big data software is a scheduler. Right? You want all of these machines to work in synchronization. So somebody has to keep track of all the machines, what they are doing, what is the data that is available with them, what is the best strategy by which the execution of the data processing jobs can be distributed. So that is the job of a scheduler. Now, if you decide to go on an adventure and write your own big data cluster software, you would have to worry about a lot of things. You would have to worry about how to distribute the data across the machines, how to develop the best strategy for partitioning, that is. Now you have so many machines and they are commodity hardware, which means if they are high probability of failure, if they fail, what's going to happen? Can your cluster continue working even though one of the machines has failed? This is fault tolerance. Then health keeping, constantly keeping track of which machine is awake, which machine has gone down, and immediately take preemptive steps to make sure that the machines come back up. That's health keeping. Then scheduling strategy, what is the most effective way of distributing the work across the cluster so that it gets finished in the least amount of time. That's the scheduling strategy. And there are many other concerns that you have to worry about. So these are the challenges of writing your own software which works on a big data cluster. But the good news is you don't have to, because somebody has already done this beautiful work, and one of them is Hadoop, and this is what we will cover in the third unit. But this is a good time to pause and have a quick discussion.